Really excited about this week's podcast. Professor Chris McLellan. We're going to chat a topic we talked about years ago, cortisol. What is it? Why is it important? And what is the role of it in the body? Let's rip in.
Welcome to the Body Science Podcast. As always, the information contained in this podcast is for the information purposes only and is not designed to diagnose or be prescriptive to treat, prevent, or manage any injury, disease, or other health-related condition.
Hey team, it's Greg from Fit, Happy, Healthy Central Body Science. I'm sitting here today with our first podcast ever in the Body Science podcast series. And with me every week from now on is the big man himself, Dr. Chris McLellan, one of Australia's ultimate sports scientists. Like, you probably don't like that word ultimate, but I'm throwing that out there because...
Big rap.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gregory.
Yeah. Look, if you want to look up the big dog himself, it's... at the Dr. Mac on Insta, is that right?
That's the handle.
That's the handle. It's average, guys. Don't get too excited, but it will get better. I promise
It will
you.
improve.
Yeah.
It's not probably what it could be.
Yeah. If you're looking to get reading notes or anything that we say, or if we put any pretty graphs up or etc. in relation to this, it'll be at bodyscience.com.au/podcast.
It will. Awesome.
So, mate, let's not muck around. We're here to kick some goals, and the first topic we want to talk about is cortisol.
Yeah, we're straight into it. Hey,
maybe a bit of a background why we're talking to you about cortisol.
Yeah, man. So big topic, and great to be here for a start, and great to be part of these podcasts are going to get rolled out. We talk a lot, right, about podcasts and why we're doing this thing, and there's a camera here. I never know whether to look at the camera. It doesn't really matter.
Look in my eyes, mate.
Yeah. That could get out of control really quickly. So there's a lot of information out there, right? Social media, the internet, and
we love a good ebook.
We do love it, an ebook, and we listen to a lot of podcasts and on a range of topics, and there's some good information out there. There's some information out there that's perhaps less useful for the end user, and so what I think we're trying to do here is provide information that comes from an evidence-based perspective. So if people aren't really familiar with what that even means, in the world of research there are lots of ways we can get information. And fundamentally, from a research perspective, we talk about peer review, and that is that it's been through a process of quality. And so we want to use information that comes from quality sources and not hit anybody over the head with hard science and big names, although we'll do plenty.
I'm sure you'll drop a few of those words.
Yeah, we'll do a little bit of that. But, it's not about trying to impress people with different names and different big words. It's about let's formulate this into a structure that is good for the end user, and the end user is the person in the gym, the person on the training paddock, the person in the shopping aisle, whatever it might be. So I envisage that this thing's going to hit all demographics. So, it's for CrossFitters, it's for bodybuilders, it's for the avid gym goer, and by bodybuilding I mean everybody, mate. I mean bikini, figure, fitness, classic physique, all of those. We're non-federation specific, right? So as far as I'm concerned, for those that are competing in the physique world, certainly we intend to provide information for everybody.
Perfect.
And really diverse backgrounds, general practitioners, dietitians, strength conditioning coaches, comp prep coaches, whatever they are, PTs. Do you see I threw that in? I had to throw that in, right?
That yourself,
yeah, we'll get that. Naturopaths, chiros, physios. I think there's going to be something for everybody. We want to cover all those bases. So
we've got some good people coming on.
We'll
experts know
without talking it up too much, but absolutely, it's about diverse input. Not trying to be all things to all people. It's more about let's get some good information out there so that people can use it. So you mentioned cortisol.
So we're talking about stress here and we talk about cortisol. What are we talking about?
Yeah, so cortisol, well, I guess fundamentally it's corticosteroid, right? And so it comes from cholesterol, and I'll get into that in a minute. But my thing, I guess why I feel that I'm in a position to even talk about cortisol is, I have a PhD, and that PhD did investigate cortisol adaptations in elite athletes, rugby league players, to training, travel, competition, sleep, a whole lot of stuff. Tracked them for years. I've done
Years?
thousands of tests. Yeah.
Thousands, wow.
Done a ton of tests, used saliva, used blood, used all of those sort of modes of analysis of not only cortisol, but a number of other hormones that we'll talk about along the way, testosterone. We'll get into some immune system function. And so that's what I did. I looked at physiology, I looked at endocrinology, which is hormones. I looked at immunology and the adaptations of the immune system to all different types of stimuli. And biochem. And so we looked at, muscle damage markers, creatine kinase, myokinase, etc. So, we'll get to that throughout the whole course of this. I intentionally use the word stimulus and not stress. I think stress, I think there's a negative connotation that comes with the word stress. Everyone thinks that stress is a bad thing. I actually think you need some stress in your life, right? If you didn't have any stress in your life,
no stress, not alive.
You're in bad shape, right? So, and when I talk about and we're going to get to cortisol in a minute. I'll get off my rant, but I think we're bombarded, right? Social media, popular media, all different types of media. We're constantly told how stressed we are, right? And I said I've done thousands of tests, and when people come to me and they say my cortisol's elevated, I say, well, how do you know, right? Go and get it tested, and you can, and.
So what's someone doing if they want to get their cortisol tested?
How
are they doing that?
Oh, they go to their GP. They can get a blood test.
And they're asking for a cortisol test?
Yeah, there's a cortisol challenge test that you can have that actually determines whether or not you actually have some cortisol
is that
dysregulation.
Invasive, or is that?
It's a blood test.
Blood test, yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm not getting one then?
You've got to go on. It's called phlebotomy, So it's
called what?
It's got not a lobotomy. It's a phlebotomy. A phlebotomist is a person that takes blood samples.
So the doctor hands me the result?
Yeah.
What's he going to say? Like, what's high, what's
he or
low?
she.
Oh, sorry, my apologies.
He or she will talk to you about...
My doctor's male, so I apologise.
Okay, fair enough. So, cortisol is a hormone that has a diurnal response. So we talk about this all the time. Nocturnal things come out at night. Diurnal things come out in the day, right? So I think most people know that cortisol has this pattern of release.
Yep.
Where it tends to be elevated in the morning, and we get a cortisol. It's called the cortisol awakening response, a CAR,
which we need because we want to get up.
Yeah. You want to get out of bed, you want to get amongst it, and get into your day, and then there'll be a general slope throughout the day, leading to a reduction in cortisol with little spikes along the way. So, whatever happens in your day and what you're exposed to throughout the day. Stress, cortisol is something that you cannot escape. It's a natural part of daily function. And so it's like taxes. And this is probably left of field, but, you can't avoid tax. You've got to pay your taxes, but you don't want to pay any more tax than you have to.
Yep.
Right? So that's why you find a good accountant, and so they help you with your taxes. It's the same with cortisol. You're going to have spikes in cortisol. Absolutely normal, natural part of the day, but you want to avoid these unnecessary spikes or it remaining unnecessarily elevated throughout the day.
Gotcha.
And you can do that. And there's strategies that we can do that. There's nutrition, there's supplements, there's a whole lot of different activities or strategies we can use to do that. Now, what is normal? Because a lot of people sort of say to me, well, what's a normal level? And again, most people won't really know what this means, but it's about 10 to 20 micrograms per deciliter. 10 to 20 is the range.
When you get your blood test, on my test?
Yeah, it'll come in like that. Now,
can I ask one more silly question while we're here?
Yeah.
And I know you're just about to launch into some info.
Yes, that's all right.
So if I have my test early in the morning and have my test late in the arvo, is that going to make any difference?
No.
No. Okay, cool. So can we move on? We can get a test from the doctor.
Yep.
Doesn't matter when you get it. Just get one.
Correct. And then if you have a follow-up test of any type, then you have it at the same time of the day.
Okay.
Yeah. If it goes above 28, well, I guess traditionally anything above 28 is high.
Okay.
And if it stays high for long periods of time, then that's what... So the word chronic means prolonged duration. Acute means sort of immediate. Mm-hmm. And that's probably the best way to describe it. Throughout the day, and while you sleep at night, it'll drop down as low as 3 to maybe 5, and that's kind of where it sits. So it's a really sort of normal kind of pattern of adaptation. I know where you're going to go with this, but there are people who have what's called adrenal insufficiency, and there is a condition called Addison's disease that is associated with a bona fide clinical condition associated with cortisol function. I know what you're going to ask me.
Adrenal fatigue. Let's get it out there.
Okay, so without completely alienating the naturopath community from this whole thing, adrenal fatigue is not a clinically diagnosed condition. If you go to your GP, they're not going to diagnose you with adrenal fatigue. Adrenal fatigue, if you cut to the chase, is something that was invented by a naturopath. The guy's name was James Wilson back in 1998, so 20-odd years ago.
Yep.
That's right, isn't it?
It is right,
20-odd years ago. Wrote a book called the same thing. And really fundamentally, it was something that was invented by this guy to explain a range of what are pretty non-specific symptoms that collectively were badged up and termed this adrenal fatigue.
Okay.
If you think about the general, I suppose, symptoms, so you know what the difference is between a sign and a symptom?
No, tell us.
Oh, well, a symptom is something that someone tells you, and a sign is something that you can measure.
Okay.
Okay, so someone comes in, the naturopath. So, things like, I don't know, low energy, brain fog,
Feeling run down.
These sorts of things. Trouble sleeping, can't bounce back from an illness or something like that, low sex drive, these sorts of things all collectively got bundled up into this adrenal fatigue. If you go, in my world, in academia, I rely on evidence-based practice, and I rely on world authorities on various things. So if you go by the Endocrine Society, the World Endocrine Society, there is research, and we can provide it. I'm happy to put it on this.
Let's drop the link at the bottom.
Yeah, we'll drop the link. But bona fide position statement from the Endocrine Society saying that it's not a thing. And so we don't teach it at uni because it's not a thing. And there's a big systematic review, was done in 2016 actually, that we can also drop the link to, that outlines that it's a complete myth.
Okay.
But the caveat on that is that absolutely we do get cortisol dysfunction, and we do definitely get cortisol resistance, right? Everyone's heard of insulin resistance. Cortisol resistance happens. Cortisol's a problem, don't get me wrong. Like, it can be a problem. No, I'm not sort of, suggesting that it's not a drama. It absolutely is, and people should try and identify if that's the primary issue or not. One of the things I tell students all the time, and anyone I work with, athletes or whatever, the human body's a pretty miraculous thing, mate, basically. And nothing happens in isolation, right? So it's never just one thing. Like if it's not going to just be cortisol, it's not going to just be thyroid function, it's not just going to be insulin, it's not just going to be progesterone or estrogen or testosterone. It's a cause and effect. There's a downstream effect that all of these things have. If you do your ACL, you did your ACL, didn't you? No. But you've had low back injuries, and
I have, yeah.
You've had a whole lot of things, right? So like if you have a what do you have, a disc injury?
L4, L5 replacement.
Yeah, okay. So if you blow out a disc, right, the problem isn't just going to be your disc, right? There's going to be a whole myriad of knock-on effects associated with muscle function, ligamentous function, tendon issues, inflammatory conditions. It all gets pretty busy pretty quickly. Pain, chronic pain, and cortisol is associated with chronic pain, mate. Nothing happens in isolation. So that's where I kind of get on my little high horse a little bit, like I am now, and you can't get a word in. But, fundamentally, people who just go, what I get concerned about is if someone goes, I'm a bit off my food, I'm not sleeping real well, and I feel a bit stressed, and someone goes, you've got adrenal fatigue. Garbage, right? It could be a bucket load of things. So let's just get it sorted out, right? Let's just get it tested. If you go to someone and you give them those kind of symptoms and they go, yep, adrenal fatigue, no stimulants for 6 months, blah, 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 turn around and walk away.
Okay.
Right? Because that's not it, right? It could be a whole lot of stuff. Okay. The 101 or the download on cortisol is really simple, right? It's, as I said, it's a glucocorticoid. It's synthesized from cholesterol. if we want to get into the deep dive on it, it's produced in an area of the adrenal cortex within the adrenal gland that is actually sitting on top of your kidney. So it's nowhere near your brain, which we've learned pretty recently. The actual area is called the zona fasciculata.
Can you say that again?
The zona fasciculata, and I'm not going to say it 3 times fast.
Wow.
But really, fundamentally, it's driven by the anterior lobe of your pituitary.
Okay.
That releases a hormone. It's called adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and that drives the whole system. The stimulus around that, or what makes a whole bunch of things. The reason I originally looked at cortisol in research, 10 years ago almost, is I wanted to know, the fundamental question was, how does it impact on performance and recovery?
Yep.
And is it a big player? And it's a player. It's not but I keep coming back to the fact it's not the only player, right? And I say that because it's blunt. And by blunt, I mean there are lots of things that affect it. Physical stress, go and do a workout, right? You'll get a rise in cortisol. Let me tell you, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there were some people on this podcast telling people not to exercise because you spike cortisol. Let me tell you, people, that is not very good information.
We love training.
We train every day. Get into it.
Every day?
Oh, yeah, man.
Geez, that'd raise your cortisol, wouldn't it?
Oh, and that's what you want. We want to make some, well, the body's in this state of homeostasis, right? It's not going to change unless you make it.
Absolutely.
Right? So there's some really unfortunate realities in life. If you want to lose fat, it's not that hard, but you got to control some things, right? The easiest way is control what you put in your mouth.
Yep.
Right? Control what you put in your mouth, you control insulin, or at least have an impact on it.
Yeah.
And get off your ass, train, right? You've got to be in caloric deficit. I know you can, it doesn't matter what diet you're on, whether you're keto, paleo, carnivore, if it fits your macros, vegan, oh no, is that a thing?
Same thing.
No, same
Move on.
thing. Whatever. Doesn't matter, man. You got to manipulate what you put in your mouth.
Okay.
Right? Time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, the whole thing, right? It all comes back to the same thing, right? So, and I'm sure we'll cross all those bridges throughout this thing as we go. Right, I keep coming back. See, I'm on a rant. But anyway, it's not about me, Greg. It's about body science. Anyway, you're asking me about cortisol. Right, okay, so we talked about the zona fasciculata. All right, so the other area that is important that we can talk about is, I mentioned it was blunt hormone.
You did.
Right, so the limitation is that it's affected by a whole lots of things. Physical stress, emotional stress, the temperature, the environment, food, like lots and lots of things impact on cortisol and will cause these little spikes throughout the day. That's perfectly okay. That's normal, and we want that, and that's no big deal. We want to control how high it goes and how long it stays there. Okay. One of the big things, I suppose, driven down our throats is that we're really chronically stressed.
Yep.
Right. Now, I would argue the toss on that because I don't think we are. I think, there are people who have generally got stress in their life, but, cortisol's such a dynamic hormone that it's got a half-life of about an hour.
Okay.
So it goes up quick and it comes down quick, right? And so, it's not like some hormones that hang around and stay up all day. I mean, if you're stressed out of your brain, maybe, oh man, you'd have to be really exposed to a lot of stress for it to stay up and just stay there constantly. It's going to fluctuate. Okay. People use the saber-toothed tiger analogy, people getting chased down the street by a saber-tooth. I don't know if that ever happened.
I may have used that myself once or twice.
That's a Greg Youngism. And it's probably a reasonable one. It's a stimulus, right? Rather than it's a stimulus, right?
Can you imagine being that stimulated?
I can't imagine being that stimulated by a saber-toothed tiger.
So that saber-toothed tiger is chasing me right now.
Right.
What's going on in my body?
All right, okay. So, good question, Gregory. Fundamentally, there's an area of your brain called the amygdala, another big name, but it sits within what's called the limbic system of our brain. Limbic, it's a primal part of our brain. It's the inert perception that That's a saber-toothed tiger. I should be scared, and I've got to do something about it, right? And so what happens is the amygdala will effectively regulate our perception of bad things.
Okay.
Stress or stimuli. And so we have this subconscious appraisal of this stimuli that says, if that gets hold of me, that's going to be a problem. So I better do something about it. The flight or fight response, right? So you're going, that's adrenaline, man. And I would say, yeah, man, it is. So what happens is we get this formation of a stress in our subconscious. Okay, you don't have to sit there and necessarily think about it too much. But the amygdala. So a couple of things happen really quickly. There's this instinctive adaptation. We get a release of things called sympathetic adrenergic catecholamines, which again is a big name for adrenaline or noradrenaline. Now, for anyone in the American audience, I'm talking about epinephrine and norepinephrine. In Australia, we call it adrenaline. In the US and other places, it's epinephrine. So when you're watching ER and all that, and it's like, get me 10 cc's of epinephrine stat. Yeah, you like to roll that out? Greg rolls that out at lunchtime here.
Is that on Netflix at the moment? Or
Could be. I don't know. But it's adrenaline. That's what we're talking about. Okay,
so what's stopping when that's happening? We know what's happening. We're moving forward.
What happens is we get an increase in heart rate, ventilation rate, sweat rate. We get vasoconstriction. We get a sweating response. So the body prioritizes those immediate responses. So everything else gets limited. So your immune system becomes a little compromised. We don't get blood flow to our organs. So digestion slows down, like all that sort of stuff. That's why you feel sick, you're going to throw up, right? Because we have this complete shift in prioritization to we got to keep things normal. We got to stay in homeostasis, right? So the amygdala. So that's what happens. We get a catecholamine dump. You know, an adrenaline dump. Like you've just nearly run up the back of someone's car because you're on your phone. Or you know, not that any of us would ever do that. No, I know, but that might happen. You know, there might be someone doing that right now. But anyway, don't do that.
Get off your phone, Pico.
Get off your phone, Pico. Get off your phone, brother. Okay, so. I'm doing too much talking here, but so the amygdala also stimulates what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. Really fundamentally, the hypothalamus is sort of like this central regulator of our body. So the amygdala stimulates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, and most people have probably heard about that somewhere around the traps. Okay,
have we got something we can visualise? We can put a link up to.
Yeah. There's a bit of a flow diagram we can put up. It's pretty simple when we think about it, but fundamentally the hypothalamus is like this central regulator of hormone function and a whole range of other things in the body. Okay, what happens is the amygdala stimulates this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The hypothalamus releases what's called corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. CRH triggers ACTH, or adrenocorticotropin hormone, from the anterior pituitary. So your your brain senses something, the amygdala sends a stimulus to your hypothalamus, the hypothalamus sends a stimulus to your pituitary sends another stimulus to your adrenals, to your adrenal cortex. Cortisol goes up. Okay, the immediate response is cortisol. Why? Because cortisol's really fundamental role is to increase the availability of fuel substrates, glucose, fatty acids, things like that, for action, right? It's making fuel available for us to do something about the stimulus in our world. Okay, and that's the fundamental process by which it works. Now, cortisol binds to these things called glucocorticoid, I'll get it out eventually, receptors. So it's a hormone. It binds onto a receptor. Lock and key mechanism, right? One lock, one key.
Yep.
And what happens is when we have this excess amount of cortisol in our blood, it actually works by what's called a negative feedback loop. And by nature of having extra cortisol in our blood, it goes back up and tells the hypothalamus and the pituitary, hey, we've got enough, let's relax, let's switch off, right? And so it stops stimulate your adrenals, and in a perfect world, and there's a reduction in cortisol. Life goes back to normal, okay? What happens in life, and from time to time, and things when we get this prolonged stimulus, is there's a problem with that switch-off mechanism, okay? So because it's a hormone and because it binds to these receptors, there's only so many receptors. And once we have, constant flooding of cortisol in the system because of too much stimulus, too many keys and not enough locks, right? Too many cortisol molecules and not enough receptors for them to land on, that's a problem. And so that's where we start to see all these negative effects that we hear about with cortisol. Okay. Inflammation and, muscle breakdown and all this sort of stuff, right? Because it then becomes catabolic. Catabolic is breakdown of muscle, basically, right? Well, yeah, that's a simplified way of looking at it. But that's the fundamental role, right? Now, and that when we have this chronic response, we end up with cortisol dysfunction, right? Because there's nowhere for it to go. Right, and that lends itself to what we call cortisol resistance. Okay, why it matters and why it's a product, why it's a problem is because it disrupts that negative feedback. Right, so there's no switch-off mechanism. So when people say adrenal fatigue, I actually look at it. It's not fatigue; it's overdrive.
Okay,
so it's not the adrenals don't get tired. It's like your pancreas doesn't get tired. It just gets it just stays switched on, really fundamentally. So I get a bit funny about the terminology we use, but anyway, so that's how it basically works, and we end up with inflammation or things called pro-inflammatory mediators.
So you're pulling the word inflammatory out a fair bit at the moment, that inflammatory response.
Yeah.
That's an exaggerated response, obviously, you're talking about there.
Yeah. It's a persistent response.
So what's going... Let's just dumb this down a little bit for me. What's going on in the body at the moment when that's happening?
Well, we get these things called mast cells. And they're pro-inflammatory. So they lead to increased inflammation. Okay. So... And
that's a real naughty thing long term, isn't it?
Yeah, because inflammation leads to what's called oxidative stress. Free radicals, people have heard of those.
Yes.
Bad things, that can lead to... It actually has a big impact on ageing process, tissue degeneration, and chronic disease, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic low back pain, rheumatoid arthritis, those sorts of things.
Nasty.
Right? Nasty stuff you don't want in your life, right? And actually, there's a bit of research around, and you've had low back issues, so you know what I'm talking about here, but chronic low back pain, by nature of having chronic exposure to back pain, the brain's an interesting thing, mate. You actually forget what it's like not to have pain. So that's what we have, these chronic pain syndromes, and that's cortisol on its own is not going to do that, but cortisol can contribute to that because of its effect on inflammation. So, and it gets pretty complicated, mate. There, in terms of some of the hormones, there's various things, and we don't need to go there. But that's the rudimentary method by which it works. Is that fair?
Yeah. That was impressive. I like that. That was really good. Yeah. Mate, I'm going to get to the 101 here, and I know it's not the whole cortisol picture.
Yes.
Cortisol and fat gain.
Oh, yeah. So it's complicated, man.
We all want to know this. This is the real reason we're listening to this.
This is it, right? And I bang on about it. Cortisol on its own is not going to make you fat.
Yeah, we got that.
It'll contribute to it 100%, no question. It'll contribute to increased, cortisol, there's some research around the maturation of pre-adipocytes. An adipocyte is a fat cell, okay? Pre-adipocytes to become mature adipocytes. Direct links with cortisol, right? So that's a thing, right? Cortisol... it has an impact. If you've got a crappy diet and your lifestyle habits aren't great and you've got a ton of stress in your life and you have no way of really, controlling that through diet or supplementation or exercise or whatever, then, man, it's a pretty complicated, mix of stimuli that lead to, increased fat gain.
Yep.
Feel miserable, can't get out of your own way. So it's peripherally mediated. I kind of use this term a lot. It's peripherally mediated, so it affects your fat.
I have no idea what that means.
Well, peripheral means on the outside, but it's centrally driven,
okay.
Which means things like your hypothalamus, your central nervous system, organs, yeah? Yep. So it's what's going on inside affects what you can see on the outside.
Gotcha.
Yeah, okay. But then there are some things that you can't see, like visceral fat. So, I mentioned those receptors, those glucocorticoid receptors.
Yes.
Okay. So fat cells have a lot of them, particularly visceral fat. And so that's where, from a health perspective, there are direct links between fat gain and particularly nasty fat gain, which is fat around your organs, which is visceral fat, and cortisol levels. Okay. So it all, there's an interplay between all these. Now, there's lots of research that is causative, that presents causative relationships between elevated cortisol levels and stress and fat and obesity particularly. And I've given you a couple along the way, and we can put some.
And we'll drop those.
Yeah, we can drop them on there. And things like shift work.
That's interesting. Let's talk about
shift
that.
work's interesting, man. Well, it's actually more around diurnal patterning of hormonal responses and circadian rhythm. And the circadian rhythm is you're basically a 24-hour clock. Yep. Okay, so and how that can be dysfunctional or not work properly or perfectly if you're awake all night and you're asleep all day, we're not made to do that, right? Okay. So and it's not just cortisol, there's a ton of hormones, right? But your circadian rhythm will impact on a whole range of things, but metabolism is one, and how you metabolize foods, your gut microbiome, and we need to, maybe we'll get I'm not an expert on the gut, and I don't profess to be, but, the gut is getting a lot of attention at the moment in health and fitness. Yes. And I would say, I keep coming back to this thing, it's not just your gut. Yeah, okay. Your gut's part of it, 100%. Absolutely. But it's one player in a really complicated group of things that will collectively produce an outcome. If you've got a problem with your gut microbiome, so the little good things in your gut that digest food and things like that, that's a problem, don't get me wrong. But just fixing that, or just you're not going to fix that without having an impact on other things, with your nutrition and your diet and your lifestyle and that sort of thing. So, it's not a one-trick pony, right? And this is what I think the problem is, and I've said this to you before. Right now in health and fitness, with all of the noise going on, it's hammer and nail, man, right? If all you got for those that don't know what I mean, if all you've got's a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So if your thing, and this is what I'm seeing a lot of, these proponents of gut health and whatever, cortisol or whatever, they're going, no, it's all about cortisol. It's all about the adrenals. It's all about your gut. It's not. It's all about all of them, And so one size does not fit all. Yep. Not everything looks like a nail. And that's where, I just encourage people to ask questions, right? If you go and see someone, whether it's a personal trainer and personal trainers are at the front line of health and fitness, right? That's where people go.
Absolutely.
Because they want information around how to exercise, how to modify their diet. And I know there's, lots of people who get on their high horse around scope of practice, but they're at the front line, right? So and there's an expectation that they're giving you good information. And I could get onto a long rant around quality training of PTs, because I think there's a long rant that can be had there. But
that would raise your cortisol, Macca. We don't want to do that. Yeah,
raise my cortisol. But you know what? They're at the front line of this thing, and so we want them to give people good information, and hopefully this is a source, or at the start of a source of that can give them some good info. When it comes to fat gain and it comes to cortisol, it's a significant player, right? And so cortisol also has it's actually what's called an antagonist. So an antagonist is something that works the opposite. Okay. So insulin and cortisol are fundamentally antagonists. So cortisol can, because of the hormone receptors I mentioned. Mm-hmm. Okay. So because they downregulate those glucocorticoid receptors, cortisol does. That has to have an effect on other things, right? So that has an effect on insulin. That has an effect on insulin resistance. And we know people are pretty familiar with insulin resistance as a medical condition. Yes. And sort of the knock-on effects of that. So, and it's basically, deregulated capacity to metabolize glucose and function, normally from a metabolic perspective. Anyway, cortisol as I mentioned, its function is to increase effectively circulating glucose, right? And you mentioned what else it does. Well, yeah, I mentioned it suppresses the immune system and all of those things as well. Cortisol enhances a couple of things. Lipolysis. So lipolysis is effectively the breakdown of lipids to triglycerides.
Yep.
They're just the little working parts of it, right? Okay, so cortisol will increase the function of a thing called hormone-sensitive lipase, HSL. Hormone-sensitive lipase is... Let's simplify it. It's the fat-burning component of thermoregulation. Okay. The other thing it does is, and it does that by breaking down these triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol, fundamentally, which we get with an increase in adrenaline, and we get it with an increase in cortisol.
Okay. So
that's kind of how that works. But it drops your insulin a little bit. The other thing is the cortisol has an impact on is another enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, LPL. Okay, so that's activated by insulin. And it's involved in the uptake of triglycerides into fat cells. Makes you fatter. Okay. So insulin, I know, right? It's pretty complicated. This is why I say it's pretty complicated, right? But you get that, right?
I get it. Yeah, it makes
There's
sense.
a couple of enzymes that are associated with breaking down the fat and then driving the fat into the fat cells.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Which makes you fatter.
Yep.
Okay. So, and everyone's familiar with, I think most people are pretty familiar with insulin. It's a peptide hormone, comes from your pancreas fundamentally. It's a really anabolic hormone, and it regulates carbohydrate metabolism, really fundamentally. Cortisol gets in the way of that somewhat by inhibiting a thing called gluconeogenesis in the liver. Now, gluconeogenesis is really just the breakdown of non-carbohydrate sources into glucose. So, we talk about cortisol being catabolic. So it's breaking down amino acids and proteins and stuff, and that's what gluconeogenesis is. Right, so it's pretty complicated, but because insulin promotes things like unsaturated fatty acid synthesis and glucose uptake and that sort of thing, cortisol can get in the way of that, leading to insulin resistance, and that's a bad outcome for everybody. Yeah, and that can then lead itself to increase in fatty deposits and increase adipose tissue and fat. It's not as simple as that, really, but because cortisol's an antagonist for insulin, it counteracts insulin's activation. This is good. Activation of glycogen synthase in muscle, insulin inhibition of lipolysis in fat and things like that. Anyway, the net effect is together those two, cortisol and insulin, increase the lipoprotein lipase, right? And dampen the hormone-sensitive lipase. The net effect of that is you get an increase in uptake of triglycerides into fat cells, and you get fat. Right? So it's not just cortisol. It's not just insulin. There's this interaction between them. And, I've probably given the 5-minute overview of some pretty intense physiology.
Absolutely, we get that.
Yeah, okay. So, but, hopefully that gives people a bit of a working understanding of that. The other player, you got what were you going to say?
Well, mate, I was just going to ask. So that's obviously a big issue for someone who's already holding weight.
Massive. Yeah. And that's why people say it makes it harder to lose fat, for sure, right? Because it's actually working against your ability to lose fat. Yeah. And often if you've got your diet on, you're getting your diet going in check and you're doing some exercise, but you've still got these other dramas and other things going on in your life. You're never going to be stress-free, right? Everyone's got stress in their life. Even you've got stress, which is a big thing, right? Can you believe it? Do you have stress?
Yeah, I'm living the dream though, mate.
Yeah,
I love it.
I'm living in a dream.
I'm happy.
You're living the dream, yeah. Anyway, because there's a knock-on effect, mate. I mentioned, thyroid.
Yep.
So cortisol has an impact on your thyroid as well. It actually impacts on T4, which is thyroxine, conversion to T3, which is a pretty big name, but it's triiodothyronine, which is called T3 and 4. Okay, so basically low cortisol or cortisol interrupts your thyroid function.
Yep.
Okay. And T3 is just the active form of the thyroid hormone, fundamentally.
Okay.
But what it does is high cortisol decreases the conversion of T4 to T3. And I'm not going to get complicated with it, but it increases the conversion of T4 to reverse T3.
Wow.
Reverse T3 is just it's a mirror. It's a non-active mirror version of T3.
Okay.
You actually need it because you don't want huge amounts of circulating active T3 floating around your body. You want the reverse T3. It's competitive receptor binding and stuff like that, but it's part of normal function in your life. Well, you're still with me, aren't you? It's pretty simple. You got some hormones. It switches one off and switches one on.
I'm getting it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Anyway,
it's not a topic I talk about every day.
But T3 is the metabolically active form of the thyroid hormone. Increases things like cardiac output and all that sort of stuff, heart rate and all that sort of stuff. Probably the other player in the whole game is leptin. Leptin, which you probably heard about. Leptin has receptors on your hypothalamus, and going right back to where we started with this thing, hypothalamus is a key regulator of cortisol function.
We got that early?
Yeah. So leptin acts on these receptors in your hypothalamus and actually has an impact on hunger and satiety. So satiety is your feeling of fullness, right? And so leptin's made predominantly in fat cells, in adipose cells.
Okay.
And that's where it comes from, right? So I mentioned to you one time, you're not hungry. You don't get hungry because you're fat. You're fat. No, hang on a minute.
Here we go.
You
don't get hungry.
You're hungry. No, you're not. You don't get fat because you're hungry. You're hungry because you're fat.
Yes.
And that's pretty much how it breaks down. The other thing is we get this cortisol can increase a thing called neuropeptide Y.
Yep.
Which again, we're getting kind of into deep water here, but
makes me hungry.
Craving of fatty foods, sweet foods, stuff like that. Yeah. So
how much of a stimulation is that on appetite? I know you're not.
Which one?
You're not going down the dietetic path, and we'll get some dietitians.
I'm not a dietitian.
We'll get the
I
dietitians on soon.
Dietitian.
I get that.
What was the question?
I can't remember my question.
How much of an impact?
How much is that stimulating appetite?
Which one?
What you were just talking about.
Neuropeptide Y. You didn't want to say it.
No, I don't want to say any big words on this.
How much? Well,
no more than 4 letters in any word.
Kind of like how long's a piece of string, mate? Because it depends on the levels of it.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm saying. I can't just say a lot or not much. It depends. Because what you have is different to me, is different to someone else.
Yep.
And so leptin's stimulated by insulin as well, right? And so when you have a high-fat meal, you'll have lower leptin levels. Mm-hmm. When you have and fasting drops your leptin.
Okay.
So, there's a lot of things you can use there that will have an impact on fat and that sort of thing. The other player is ghrelin. Ghrelin's another peptide hormone produced by the stomach, and again, ghrelin actually will increase your hunger. So when your stomach's empty, you get an increase in ghrelin, and you want to eat fundamentally. So, and leptin, comes from our fat cells. So the more fat cells, the more leptin, and so, this is where I say all of these systems collectively contribute to things like hunger, cravings, what you eat. What you eat will then have an impact on, insulin levels. How you eat it, when you eat it, and what else is going on in your life will affect your cortisol levels. And so, it's a pretty murky soup, mate, that will have an impact on how all these things work. So I guess the message today is, does it matter? Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything you can do about it? For sure. And that's where, there's conversations around lifestyle management. Anyone says just going to get cortisol out of your life completely, you're kidding yourself. But can I do things that will limit the impact? Definitely. And, without doing the hard sell, there's good supplements on the market that will have an impact on it, and Body Science have a product, and I'm not doing the hard sell at all, but Body Science have a product. The clinical,
don't mention hydroxybone clinical because I don't want you mentioning that at all.
Okay, so I won't mention it. But, there are products on the market that are, very much should be considered by people as strategies around, what you're going to do about it. So the take home is you can get it tested. Yep. So I recommend that you do. Yep. My other recommendation is to ask questions of people that you...
and who are we asking?
Well, like I said, PTs are going to be at the front line, right? I think your go-to has to be the medical community. We need to start with, your GP, and you need to ask good questions about how that all works, and get some information. But even your PT, ask them. I'm big on bona fide credentials.
Yeah.
I'm big on asking people, if you tell me that you've got a degree, I want to see your testimonial. Show me it. And that's where we get into a conversation around good quality education, because there's people out there. It's really confusing for people, like on social media. Everyone's a guru, everyone's an expert.
And let's be happy we are talking about these things. Like
I think it's good. I'm not trying to be.
We've got to find the good information.
I'm trying to be the big naysayer. All I'm saying is that, Daniel Ricciardo is a world champion Formula One driver.
Yep.
He doesn't necessarily need to know how the machine works.
Yes.
And what I'm saying to you is, just because someone's walking around with a great rig and a six-pack,
Yep.
doesn't mean they know too much about anything, right?
Okay.
And that's, unfortunately, we always say don't judge a book by its cover. Well, in our world, everyone judges the book by its cover. So I just say, ask questions, ask to see credentials. And, I normally say to people, don't get on the internet, but if you want to know anything about me, get on the internet. I'm not here to pump up my tyres, but if you want to know what my background is, it's on the internet. Go and check it. I welcome people to check it. And so if you go looking for someone, right, and you can't find them on the internet, or you can't find them on Insta or Facebook or LinkedIn, there would be really significant alarm bells ringing in my world if I can't find something. If someone says to me, I've got this, that, and the other thing, I'm a degree, I've got this, I've got that, and you go looking for it, you can't find it, go somewhere else.
Fair enough. Mate, good books.
What about that?
Let's
Episode
talk this
1.
up. Good books.
Oh, good books.
You reading Jason Fung's The Obesity Code?
I have run. Yeah, it's a good book. It's worth a read.
Is
Have
it
you
worth
read
people reading?
Yeah, definitely. You read it?
No, you did tell me I should though.
Yeah. Have a read. It's good. It's a good book. Really, it's pro fasting. I'm pro fasting. I'm pro.
Do you want to explain what fasting is to the people?
Intermittent fasting.
Do you want to explain what that is?
Again, we probably need to do a whole show on it. So, in the world of nutrition, time-restricted eating in humans, time-restricted feeding in animals, intermittent fasting have become really popular, right? So, have you done a bit of that? No, you've done keto.
Keto.
You're hardcore keto. Yeah.
Yeah, but not until 2 o'clock in the arvo.
Right. Okay. So, really simply,
I don't recommend anyone else do it because it's not working. But
What, the keto?
I'm enjoying. Makes me feel good.
Really?
Yeah, I feel really good.
There's probably another show on that.
Yeah,
actually,
there
there
is.
is a show
There
on
is.
that, definitely. And there's some really good info out there on the different types of. I think the thing that people get wrong with keto is that they don't get
Bacon
well.
still has calories.
Yeah, it does. But strictly keto is probably 85% fat. And I think people think it's high protein. That's a carnivore
Yeah, I run
diet.
more of a 75% model.
Yeah. And then there's the timing of how you have that and the types of fats. And it's pretty complicated. It's not just... I reckon it's hard to be keto. Like, unless you're good with your meal prep, to be able to operate in a keto environment is pretty difficult, I reckon. Anyway, but with the... I'm an advocate of a couple of things. Time-restricted feeding. So eating within a window.
Yep. What's your window?
Well, this is where it's changed, right? It was originally 8 and 16. The research the thought was that you had to eat your food within 8 hours and fast for 16 hours.
Yep.
Right? It was more of an intermittent fasting protocol. The reality on the back of a lot of research and more recent research, and the number one guy on the planet that I go to for my information around time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting is a guy called Sachin Panda. Do the Google.
That's a legit name.
It's a legit name. He's a bona fide expert. And there's some good podcasts that he does. And,
Okay.
And
Do you want to drop the name of those podcasts?
there's one called...
Sorry to throw it out there.
yeah, no, there's a really good one. It's Rhonda Patrick.
Okay. You might put a link in the bio of that too, Morgan.
It's I'm trying to think of the name of it. She's got a name for it, but she's really bright. It's deep though.
Okay.
Like they dive deep on the technicalities of it, and so I think the average person might get a little bit lost, but they have great information for it. I'm big on time restricted feeding. So the window isn't 8 hours, right? The reality is that window can be 10, 11 hours. I think 11 and 13 is where we're at now, and so that leads into a conversation. We'll talk about it. Fasted cardio, because I don't think most people doing their cardio in the morning are fasted properly. It takes 12, 16 hours to deplete the liver of glycogen.
Okay.
So if you ate at 8 p.m. and you get up at 6,
it's not happening.
You're not fasted. No.
We might get a dietitian on to talk about that.
I reckon we should. But I like my time restricted feeding. So the difference between time restricted feeding and intermittent fasting is that fasting generally still has a significant caloric reduction, whereas the time restricted feeding is the same amount of caloric intake, just in a smaller window. Okay. And I like diurnal eating as well. Like eat according to your microbiome. So what you eat in the morning versus what you eat in the middle of the day versus what you eat at night, because our gut flora shifts throughout the day. Mm-hmm. So what sort of foods we have, whether we have high fat, carbs, or whatever, you can eat according to your gut microbiome. And I'm an advocate of all of that stuff. And because I'm a specimen, clearly it's working. That was a pun at myself.
Mate, I'm loving that.
I'm doing all right. 48, killing it.
We have to stop now, though. Yeah. But you are coming back next week. You're part of this every week.
Thank you.
We've got some good people coming on too.
That'll be a great pleasure.
bodyscience.com.au/podcast. There'll be some graphs. There'll be some links. There'll be some notes. And hopefully you guys get on and love it.
Excellent.
Thanks, Macca. You're the man.
All right.